The Abraham sacrificing Isaac story. It's a great story, isn't it? A great tale. The patriarch of the religions of the Word, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, is willing to sacrifice his beloved son, the son of his old age, the only child born by his wife that removed the stigma of her barrenness, because God told him to. A great story because we sure don't forget it. But being a great story doesn't make it a good or an easy story. Of all today's readings, it's perhaps the one best avoided. And as you can see, Dimitri tried to gift me with that by putting Jeremiah in. It's challenging to listen to. We identify with it, for we know how to be a parent and what it is to be a child. It reveals that there are perhaps fault lines running through our faith story, inconsistencies if we insist that God is good and loving, fault lines we would rather not know about, for they make our faith narrative and us vulnerable to criticism and critique. The Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac story raises for us questions I suspect we would prefer not to face or even ask. Because what if we could not bear the answers? It might cause us to ask what sort of man this Abraham is, and he a patriarch, example to us of faithful living that we would rather not emulate. What sort of faith test is this that he's put to? Will it be asked of us? What sort of faithfulness does this demand? Do we even want to be like that? And undergirding all of this, what sort of God is this that would demand such a monstrous thing? Of course, this is if we come to the story with our presuppositions intact, with our already formed ideas of what God should be and be doing, of how Abraham as a father should act, of what should happen and what we think is going on here. Ears and minds full, if you like, of our own rhetoric, we shape the words as we read, interpret the story as we listen, judge it according to our expectations, what we think it should say, what we want it to speak into us, where we are from. The context of our life, all we have learned about the Bible, about God, about living faithfully, about right and wrong, about being a parent and or a child, all of our life experience influences how we meet this text. And perhaps we do try to make this story fit, however awkwardly, into our world where God and characters like Abraham have place. Or maybe we don't. Maybe we would rather leave it in that corner of just too difficult stuff. Our intention excludes such stories from having any particular impact, so they don't disturb our view of Abraham or God. You see, when we hear a story like this, I think we get drawn into it. We sort of participate in it. We identify with characters, if you like. And when we're in the drama, we are judging the characters, Abraham, God, what happens by our standards. And it is incredibly difficult to extricate ourselves from getting into a narrative like that and to hear it with fresh ears. It's inevitable that who we are influences our capacity to perceive. But of course, this is not just confined to religious stuff. I want to share with you a delightful story that illustrates something of this. Have any of you heard of this chap called Eduardo Cirelli? He's written Ripples from Zambezi. He's got some interesting critiques of what NGOs do effectively. Anyway, he worked for an Italian NGO that was involved in technical cooperation in Africa. And he tells of this particular project that he was involved with, where the Italian people decided that they would go into Zambia and they would teach the Zambian people how to grow food. They arrived with Italian seed in Zambia's absolutely magnificent valley going down to the Zambezi River to teach the local people how to grow Italian tomatoes and zucchini. The local people had absolutely no interest in doing that, so they were paid to come and work, and sometimes they would show up. The Italians were utterly amazed that the local people in such a fertile valley would have no agriculture. Instead of asking them why they didn't grow anything, they simply said, "Thank God we are here, just in the nick of time to save the Zambian people from starvation." Of course, everything in Zambia grew beautifully, and they had these magnificent tomatoes, and the zucchini were to die for. And we were telling the Zambians, look how easy agriculture is. When the tomatoes were ripe and red, and the zucchini were ready for picking, overnight, 200 hippos came up from the river and ate everything. And we said to the Zambians, "My God, the hippos!" "Yes," they said, "that's why we have no agriculture here." "Why didn't you tell us?" This is Italian, You never asked. So Sorelli's advice is, if you really want to help, you do it by developing relationship. And the first thing you have to do is to shut up and listen. So when we hear today's Abraham and Isaac story, let's perhaps take seriously that refrain that we all mumbled our response to. Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. And in the words of Eduardo Sorelli, shut up and listen. Ask rather than assume we know. Listen to what might be being revealed to us today from this text of the human wrestle to know how to enact a relationship of integrity with the divine in this world, in our context, and the incredible challenge to know how to discern that which brings life and act for its flourishing. And today we do so in the context of Refugee Sunday. That one day in our liturgical year we pay attention to the daily crisis for life for millions of people who through no fault of their own no longer have anywhere to stand or live. Refugees are those who seek refuge, shelter, protection, safety from danger and trouble. These days we see as much as we hear the stories. Horrifying images, millions of people forced to flee, to seek refuge away from what was home, but has become a life-destroying context of conflict and too often unreasoned hatred. I could share with you the statistics, but they are mind-boggling. They're so unimaginable to become actually numbing. And it's really hard to know quite what to do. So what resource might this Abraham story be for us on Refugee Sunday? As I said at the outset, Abraham and then Isaac are beginning patriarchs in the faith tradition in which we stand. If we consider the narratives as they unfold since then, we can see that our narrative coheres around characters who are made refugees. Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Abram and Sarai leave from home with only promise of what would become. Moses from Egypt, then the whole Israelite nation. Truth-speaking prophets are forever being cast out. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. From baptism, Jesus becomes refugee in the wilderness. It almost suggests it is the call of faithful people, our call to understand ourselves as refugees. I somehow doubt that any of us would choose to exchange place with someone who's a refugee or prefer to be driven from our home in fear of our life, to be stripped of everything that makes us secure, unknowing, and utterly vulnerable to the whim of chance and circumstance. I very much doubt that we would prefer to have all that secured us and made us know who we are taken away. And yet, are we not, like Sarah and Abraham, Miriam and Moses, and the myriad of those in our faith story, also people of faith? If this is so, we are not very well resourced to know how to live as people who are refugees. So maybe this Refugee Sunday, we're being asked to stop, to listen, and to learn. Not just to assume we already know what Refugee Sunday is about, to do for or to do to the refugee. Because if our call is to live as if we were refugees, we might need to listen to the story of one who is a refugee, to know how and what it is to be one of those, why bearers of faith have been refugees. How on earth is this imaginable or even possible that living as if we were a refugee would be asked of us? How on earth could there be anything good in being a refugee? So I want to tell you a story, the story of Auckland. She's a Dinka woman from the southern Sudan who, starving, had walked with her baby son Rial for 4 days and 3 nights to reach an Oxfam feeding centre. Once she had had a husband, a cow, a field. But last year her husband had died. The crop had failed in the terrible droughts. People were dying around her, and she had barely eaten for 2 months. With the baby, she set off to look for food. The story of this 4-day trek is a terrible one, being turned away from feeding centres, the baby and herself creeping ever nearer to death. When they finally reached the Oxfam centre, Rial was barely breathing. He was found to have diarrhoea, to be anemic, and to be suffering from hypothermia and dehydration. Exhausted, mother and son curled up on a blanket and slept. She awoke later and was given more food, and then something amazing happened. Even as babies were dying, one by one, the mothers left their children on the mats and joined together in a circle. They started singing. It sounded like the tiny bells which the Dinka attached to the horns of their best cattle. They sang courting songs, songs of prosperity and hope, songs of praise to the cows they didn't have and to the life they only half had. They clapped, they moved back and forth, pounded the baked earth, whistled and laughed. It was light in the darkness. Slowly, Auckland hobbled over to join them, taking up the rhythms and the dance. In minutes, all those in the centre, assistants, mothers who had been grieving, children and doctors were dancing and singing. It was a great act of defiance against the rotten climate, the accursed war, the land that wouldn't produce, the armies, the cattle raiders, and all the troubles. Auckland and these mothers teach us about hope, about community, its potency and how much we need it, about the immense resilience of the human spirit, about what matters most. It is not that we would choose to be in such a place or ever wish it upon another, but it is sadly and shockingly true that this is the life, the real life way it is for many people. We should seek to alleviate such suffering and perhaps more potently use our privilege and power to address its cause. Our human capacity to be inhuman and the systems we generate that perpetuate such inhumanity. Refugees are absolutely vulnerable, utterly dependent upon circumstances and people like you and I. Each of us are like this from birth. And yet amazingly, so many are not overcome, anchored in dignity and sense of self not gained by their material possessions, but in something deeper, some urge, some desire for life, even as it is. And perhaps, most surprisingly, despite all and everything that life brings with it, they have hope. So this Refugee Sunday, we might begin with a lesson in humility. Recognise that we are engaged in a relationship of mutuality with those who are refugees. We may be the ones in the position to give something from the excess of our resource. What we receive in return, though, is a treasure beyond price. A life stripped bare, revealing of what matters most, of the precious gift of life, of the simple abundance, the resilience of the human spirit, and the hope that arises from within it. Thankfulness, abundance of spirit, hope is stirred in us, even just as we listen to that story. Our hearts are curiously restored. And we did not have to pay the price of that uncovering.